Last but certainly not least, I am honored to introduce you to Harvard's very own Jeremy Nobel, who will be speaking to you tonight about loneliness and the pandemic, as well as the importance of art-based interventions. Jeremy Nobel, MD, MPH, is a primary care physician, public health practitioner, and award-winning poet with faculty employments at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and the Harvard Medical School. He is the founder and president of the Foundation for Art and Healing, whose signature initiative, Project Unlonely, addressing the personal and public health challenges of loneliness and social isolation, has gained national visibility. Dr. Nobel graduated magna cum laude from Princeton University within the Science and Human Affairs program. He received his medical education at the University of Pennsylvania and completed his internal medicine residency at the Beth Israel Hospital in Boston. Board certified in both preventive medicine and internal medicine, Dr. Nobel also holds dual master's degrees in epidemiology and public health from the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. A published poet, Dr. Nobel has received several awards for his poetry, including the Baines Swigert Prize from Princeton University and the American Academy of Poets Prize from the University of Pennsylvania. Please welcome Jeremy Nobel.
Thanks, Sarah. And while you're busy applauding, I'd like to ask for another round of applause for Kristen and Marked by COVID, which is an amazing thing, which is really wonderful that's going on. Okay, we're at that crux of the evening now where people aren't sure whether to go to sleep or just kind of feign attention for a while. Fortunately, there's food and drink. And what I'm going to try to cover today is three things. First, loneliness. Actually is increasingly viewed as a public health crisis. And it was emerging as a public health crisis even before COVID, but COVID certainly shined a light on it. We've all had our experiences with loneliness, isolation during COVID, but it's persisting. And it impacts not just individuals, but communities. And I think what I hope will be interesting to this crowd, particularly given the content of our first few talks, is how creative expression can be a modality to engage our attention, to inspire us in some ways, and then ultimately to connect us. And I was really interested in hearing from Natalie that it actually connected your group to be working with the arts, which is fantastic. But then I'm also going to just try to put it together a little bit because, one of the things that academia is often criticized for is admiring the problem. Well, we do that because you have to quantify it, you have to understand its characteristics so you can intervene. But there's a lot we can be doing to address it, and I'm going to share some of that. So you heard the kind of overview of my background. And I won't dwell on that, but I thought you should know, who is this guy really? So I'll give you a little snapshot. So I get up way too early. I was always an early riser, but I started getting up even earlier during the pandemic, and now it's kind of stuck. I'm a lifetime worrier. I've known this because my mother said I've been worrying since I was 2 years old. I have two older sisters. They didn't worry at all. They just kind of handed it down to me. I bore that responsibility. I think I still do for the foundation I lead. I'm sometimes lonely. I'll actually kind of share, I think loneliness is the most human of feelings. I think we're all sometimes lonely, and I'll try to describe when it becomes a problem. On the personal side, I love coffee and bike riding. And I re-engaged with bike riding during the pandemic because you could do it outside socially with other people without wearing a mask. And then it's always good to confess something. I'm not always as caring and compassionate as I would like. And people say, oh, how can that be? This is a picture of me when I was running the emergency room at Beth Israel Hospital. I'll just leave it at that. So we're going to have some audience participation. So polling questions. So as I said, everyone is lonely from time to time, desiring better social connection than they feel they have, right? Loneliness is this subjective feeling, right? It's not isolation, that's objective. You can count social contacts. So here we go. First question, this is a show of hands. In the last year, has someone you know been often or very lonely? possibly including you, but hands, just someone you know. Okay, that's 100%. I think the cameraman will be raising his hand too in a minute. There you go. Okay. Oh, good, the photographers. Right. Next question. In the last year, has anyone said out loud to you, I feel lonely? So I asked this question. I've been giving a lot of talks, on this topic. It's about 50%. So it's kind of already something we should be curious about, right? If we know all these people who are lonely, why are only half of them saying it out loud? Last question, very germane to tonight, is do you think loneliness is more of an issue now than before March 2020, which is when the World Health Organization declared it a crisis? More or about this? Well, let's start with more. Okay, so that's about 50%. I actually think it's more. And we're five years into it. I sometimes call it the COVID era because, as several of the speakers have mentioned, it's not just the infection. And it's not just the results of that infection and so on. It's changed how we think about ourselves, our reliance on other people, our reliance on government, our vulnerability through those reliances. And the main through line, I think, right now that is markedly more challenging is the incredible uncertainty most people are experiencing on a day-to-day basis, right? And we don't, it's hiding in plain sight, like what's going to happen next Tuesday, right? We're going to have an election. I mean, I had to go see my dentist because I'm grinding my teeth again, right? It's bruxism, right? It's all stress-related. And, so people are having this uncertainty at work, at home, in the community. And then add to the uncertainty the fact that many people are struggling now. Financially, just with health issues, huge political divides, increasing in many areas community violence. You're not even sure it's safe to go outside. Climate anxiety, the list keeps going. Grief, a growing burden, obviously a big topic for today. And distrust. People aren't sure who to trust. So this cycles back, right? If you have uncertainty and you don't know who to trust, your brain goes crazy. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And it's important to realize that you may have heard the phrase, same storm, different boats. When you have a crisis like this, the crisis might be equal in a sense, but people's vulnerability to it is far from equal. And the social circumstances that allow them to navigate it are far from equal. And so consequently, for the people most vulnerable, it is an unprecedented crisis. So it's good that we're talking about it. So now you're thinking, oh my God, I stayed through all this stuff and he's just dragging me through the mud here. Any good news? So I think there is some good news. I think we're talking about it. So how many people saw this released by our Surgeon General? Vivek Murthy, it came out May 2023, so it's been out about a year and a half. And that gets people talking. It adds credibility to it. It's really important. I put a book out, too, on this topic. And first, a little background. So Penguin Random House published this book, and I signed my agreement with Penguin Random House to write the definitive book on loneliness in January 2020. So this is like agreeing to write a book on world terrorism 2 months before 9/11. It's not like there's nothing you could say about it, but the topic kept changing. So it really, to use a technical term, it really kicked my ass. I told my editor 3 times, I can't write this book. Here's why. Because any writers in the room, either creative or expository? Yeah, so whether consciously or unconsciously, when you're writing, you're always imagining the reader. I couldn't locate the reader because things were changing so fast. I couldn't locate myself. That's a whole other story. But I couldn't locate the reader, so that was very challenging. I had 3 goals in writing the book. One was to demystify and humanize loneliness. Now that actually became easier during the pandemic because I knew more people were paying attention to it. And a lot of the, I won't say obvious things, but the foundational things about loneliness were being described. People were digging into the research and so on. So I could build on that. And then I also wanted to provide some useful observations because through the nonprofit I lead, which uses creative arts to improve health and well-being, for a variety of reasons, we started focusing on loneliness in 2012. So we had some experience with it, and I'm going to share some of that. And because the hope was that we could all begin to design solutions, both in our personal lives, but also in our communities, workplaces, and so on. Because the book could be a catalyst for that. And lastly, to introduce something that very much the theme of the evening, that how does creative expression connect us in some very fundamental ways in our brain, in our psychological manifestations of brain activation, and in our behaviors. And my hope, actually, is that individuals and organizations will design their own projects on lonely. I mean, I would even argue that Marked by COVID is a project on lonely, right? Because it allows memorialization, allows us to realize we're part of a bigger story, a bigger human narrative, and we're less alone. And then your brain calms down and the whole cycle kind of moves in a good direction. But first, just a little primer. I think most people know this, but loneliness is not, as I said, not objective. It's a subjective thing. It's the gap we perceive, we feel. So it's emotional between the social connections we aspire to have, want to have, dream about having, and what we actually think we have. And there are a lot of consequences to that, as I mentioned. You may have heard the soundbite, being lonely is like smoking 15 cigarettes a day. This has made our job easier, actually, as has the fact that, some very credible science-oriented organizations like the American Heart Association has gone on the record with a science statement saying loneliness increases risk of heart attack, stroke, or death from either by 30%. So this is the most prevalent. 50% of Americans will die of cardiovascular death. And the fact that 30% of what 50% of people die from relates to loneliness has gotten a lot of people's attention. But there's more to it, right? So there's the mental health aspect. This has been known for decades. It's probably the biggest preventable risk factor for this classic triad of depression, addiction, and suicidality. But then all these, physical illnesses came out too. But I also think it's important to think not just about the deficits of loneliness from an illness perspective, but it robs us of something to be lonely, which is the thriving and flourishing of robust social contact, like what we're doing tonight, right? So when you move away from that, you lose something in your life. You lose enjoyment of other people, you lose the pleasure of human contact. And that's very different than, okay, it's a risk factor for disease. It is a risk factor for disease, but I think it's much bigger than that. The other reason loneliness is important, this is a lot of the recent work, and what I'm really trying to emphasize is it literally changes how our brains work in what's called social cognition, how you literally make sense of the world around you. And to make it very simple for those who aren't kind of neurobiologists, though it feels like everybody is these days, we are. No, seriously, COVID did that for us. Our brains have a couple of major jobs. One is survival. So our brains are always scanning what's going on, saying, am I safe? So imagine you're walking down a street of a city that you're not familiar with, it's dusk, and some person is walking towards you. Whether you're conscious of it or not, your brain is saying, is that person a threat or an opportunity? Because they could easily be either. So, they may hurt you or they may give you directions to a great restaurant, right? And through a very interesting series of elegant experiments, a psychologist named John Cacioppo showed that as people got lonelier, they would interpret what were basically ambiguous signals as threatening. It's actually very simple to do. When you just show people cards that have images on them and you say, should I be afraid of this? People who score high on a loneliness test will see risk everywhere. I won't go fully into that in tonight's talk, but just think, if you have that kind of view of the world around you, do you want to move towards the world or away from it? Away from it, right? Because it looks scary and threatening. So what happens? You move away from the world, your brain gets lonelier. So it starts perceiving the world as even riskier. And then you start behaving a little odd, right? Because you're cautious, and then people say, oh, he doesn't really want to engage. I'm going to back off a little bit. So Jeremy gets even lonelier, right? So then you see the threat. And so this is called spiraling. That's the serious type of loneliness that's like having 15 cigarettes a day. The occasional twinge of loneliness, as I said, is the most human of feelings. In fact, you could argue it's positive because it kind of nudges, just like a little bit of stress can often make us try a little bit harder, take a few risks. A little bit of loneliness can sometimes encourage us to get over our shyness, engage with people, do something a little more positive. But other things happen in the brain too. So as you get lonelier, our brain's always they're balancing between a rational analysis of the world and an emotional analysis. And Dan Kahneman got the Nobel Prize in 2003 by basically debunking, it was the Nobel Prize in economics. And for years they were saying, how do people make economic decisions? They make rational analysis of the small decisions that lead up to the big decision. It just proves it's total nonsense. We make it emotionally and then backfill with a rational justification. And we make the emotional decision almost instantly, and then we kind of labor over the rational part. So this is what's called and he published a book called Thinking, Fast and Slow. And the fast is the emotional, and the slow is the rational. And why does that matter? Because look at the lonely brain that's sensitive to threat, and then and then you're on that street, and it's dark, but you no longer have the ability to say, well, maybe that person isn't out to get me, right? Which is rational, it's not emotional, right? It's cognitive. But as you get lonelier, you lose the ability to do that. And you just react. And the third thing the lonely brain does is it makes you more impulsive. So that barrier between contemplation and action goes down. So you take these things together and you get a very fragile world. It is what's driving the increase in mass shootings, there's no question about that. Even what's sometimes called wrong address shootings, where people by mistake will ring a doorbell by accident on a wrong house, and they get shot through the screen door. The media is no longer covering these, but they're still happening. And that's responsible journalism, because there's a contagion effect. Okay, I know, still not such great news, but I want you to be fully prepared. But the good news is, as people get less lonely, you reverse all of these. These are just brain states. They're transient. They're not locked in. Right? So they're not like permanent phenotypes, right? It's transient. So this is all good news. That means conversations like this, art making, those things can reverse all this stuff. The other thing that came out of our research, and I think this is very relevant to the COVID conversation, is that there are different types of loneliness. The first one is what most people think about loneliness, psychological loneliness. Do I have a friend? Do I have a confidant? Do I have someone who could tell my troubles to? This is the kind of connection you often lost in COVID because you were away from loved ones and you couldn't meet other people. So type 1 loneliness. The second type, though, is the loneliness of systematic exclusion because of race, gender, disability, whatever it is. You are systematically excluded by others. That's a trauma state. I mean, it's so painful that there are old cultures where that's the major punishment, is to shun people, to actually exclude them, right? So that's another kind of loneliness that was very common in COVID because of discrimination. We talked a lot about that, marginalization, for a variety of reasons, race, gender, and so forth. The third type of loneliness is existential or spiritual, and that impacted people too. Does my life have meaning, purpose? We did a lot to support frontline healthcare workers during COVID. We set up some programs, and they were doubting their own capacities. Why am I in healthcare? I mean, these really just awful self-punishing permutations. So this is what makes it very hard to measure loneliness, because there are different types of it. And the conventional scale that's used, the UCLA loneliness scale, some people may know that instrument, it's got 20 questions. They explore all these types of loneliness, but they only generate a single score. So we're developing what we think is going to be the better score for loneliness, with some support from some people in this room, by the way. Thank you for the help. So that we can actually take a survey and get a score in each one of these types as well as an aggregate score. Why is that important? Because the interventions are different, right? If you feel you don't have friends, you would address that problem differently than if you feel you're systematically excluded, right? Or don't know the mission and purpose. Anyway. So I'm not going to go deeply into more of, kind of what's useful to know about loneliness, except this last piece, which is to point out that this spiraling that I mentioned happened isn't equally distributed and tends to happen in 5, call them social domains, that in the book I call these territories of loneliness. So the first one is trauma. So COVID was plenty traumatizing, but there's other kinds of trauma, military violence, domestic violence, sexual violence. Everyone who's traumatized has a tendency to withdraw just for self-protection. So if you don't have a countervening support program, they start being at risk of spinning into this high levels of loneliness. Second one is illness. Not just catastrophic illness, but serious chronic illness. We know is marginalizing: diabetes, heart disease, and so on. But rare illness, if you're the only, so hemophilia, right? Everyone in this room has heard of hemophilia. How many people do you think in the U.S. have hemophilia? Shout out a number. Couple of million. Okay. It's lower than that.
100,000.
100,000. Oh, this is like Price is Right. It's way lower than that. It's 20,000. How can, and it turns out hemophilia, because it's a very dramatic disease, has captured our attention. But there are not that many people who have it. And so if you have hemophilia, it's a bleeding disorder, and they're mostly young men. You don't play contact sports, and so you start feeling like what's different about me. So illness is major. Aging is its own particular shit show of loneliness. You have loss of physical ability, you have loss of cognition, you have loss of friends. I mean, it's like a perfect storm. And you can have all of the other things. You could have a trauma history, you could have illness, and so on. Difference is hugely isolating, particularly in our culture, and social media has emphasized this. So this is loneliness type 2, the loneliness of systematic exclusion. And last, and unfortunately not least, is the modern world right now seems to be increasing our distrust of connecting with other people, our isolation, and then that leads to loneliness. And of course, what makes it even, I don't mean this to be some post-Halloween pentagram, but it's no ominousness intended, but you can obviously see that you can have one or many of these things together. So, okay, so what do we do about loneliness? So we know it's a diverse group of individuals and circumstances, a set of complex, overlapping drivers, concerns, and solutions, and obviously no silver bullet. So what do we do about it? So I think one of the most important things we can do for loneliness is to change our conceptualization of it from a flaw, or there's something wrong with me, or I'm inadequate, and that's why I'm lonely, to recognizing it as a biological signal. So thirst is a biological signal, right? It means we need hydration or we'll die. Brains are pretty good at that, as I said. Loneliness is just the signal that we need human connection. Now there's an evolutionary biology motivation for that, and it's a story, an evolutionary biologist might say, is it's 20,000 years ago, and you hear a rustling in the bushes outside your cave, and you think there's a saber-toothed tiger, and you think, I'm going to pick up a stick to defend myself. Don't you want to have 10 people around you also picking up sticks? Oh, okay, yes you do. And if you don't have those 10 people around you, your fight or flight's always up a little bit, and so this is the argument. Now, the question is, what is loneliness trying to get us to pay attention to? And I think it's just like I said, the need that we need human connection. Now, you might ask the question, as we have, I don't meet many people who are embarrassed and ashamed about being thirsty. Why are we so embarrassed and ashamed? Go back to that first question where only 50% of the people say they're lonely. Well, why do people not want to say out loud they're lonely? And the answer is because it's a cultural construction. And the good news about being anything culturally constructed, at least conceivably, can be culturally reconstructed. And I think that's a big part of what we're doing with creative arts, actually, is we're reconstructing the social narrative and at the same time retraining our brains and minds and so forth. So, okay. So if loneliness is the signal we need human connection, how do we do it? How do we move from being lonely to being connected? As I've already signaled, here's the not so new idea. There's never been a culture without art. Maybe it's doing something useful. All the environmental biologists say it must be or we wouldn't be doing it. And maybe that connection helps us survive. I think it does. If you break it down into what the constructs that it does, these are the four that we find very reproducible. So first is the arts engage our attention. This was always important. But think about what's going on now in the modern world with this constant fight for our attention, in social media, in advertising, in politics. I mean, it's a barrage of attention struggling in the arts. We've all had that experience. You'll hear a strain of music. You'll walk past, a photograph or some of the beautiful art here, and you just totally are engaged. This actually, as a phenomenon, is less frequent in the modern world. So I think this is enormously interesting right there. But then it does more. It inspires us. So what is inspiration? So, psychologists classify it. It's a type of motivation. But we use it for very special events. We rarely say, I'm inspired to clean my closet, right? Unless you're making a joke, right? We laugh. No, it's a motivation to do something that we feel has particular consequence. But then the arts often go even further than that. They empower people so they actually have a belief they can achieve that. This is a remarkably important activation, because most of the things, my view, that we need to do in the world require a kind of confidence that probably goes beyond rationality, frankly. Call it you need to be hopeful, you need to be optimistic, these mindsets are critical, and the arts could take us there. And then the last piece, and this is where a lot of our work comes into public health, is it connects people. And we can study that, we have studied that in all the different types of loneliness. And interestingly, all the arts work. So the traditional four: music, visual arts, language arts, and dance. And that's been true for culture for a long time, but what people actually do at scale to imagine and create are culinary arts, so cooking and so forth, textile arts, so that's knitting, sewing, crocheting, quilting, and then gardening, which I've learned to call the world's slowest performance art form. So then all these gardeners, now they feel they're artists. It's really great. So real quick, so what's going on? So behind all of this, and what kind of got my attention, I started out in the basic sciences, actually, in the MD, PhD in cellular biology and immunology, actually, very related to what Moderna does. But then I got interested in medicine, so I kind of moved forward. But it's really important to understand, and it's helpful for people, it gives them a kind of confidence, that we can now map the brain activities that are behind, that when we do things with the arts, they have brain consequences. So I won't go through all of this stuff, but just to show the multiple brain activation pathways. So the neuroendocrine system, this is, the big actor there is cortisol, right, the stress hormone, but there are others. It changes how our immune system works. It changes how every organ in the body works, including reciprocally the brain. Autonomic outflow, right, that controls things like blood pressure, heart rate, respiration. And then very importantly, neuropeptide outflow, which controls things like mood and anticipation of experience, and endorphins. So, three big reasons for the arts making us lonely. As I said, the brain. The most interesting recent neuroscience is not just the changing of hormone and neuropeptide levels, but it literally changes social cognition. So go back to that scene, if you're on a street and there's somebody coming towards you. Some really good fMRI studies were done that first, in 2018, we mapped out the social connectome, right? So the part of the brain that's detecting social threat. So we know what that looks like. That atlas is done. And then a very enterprising neuroscientist in the UK said, well, I wonder if the arts overlap that, and was able to collect all the fMRI studies that were done on the arts and show that creative expression, art forms, when you ask aesthetic questions, like was that good art or interesting art, overlaps the social connectome. So this is the or the behavioral neurologic basis for empathy and compassion, right? Because if it changes how our brains think that people are threatening, it invites us to connect with them. But there's more, and we've seen some evidence of it tonight. So the arts encourage us to tell our story. Every piece of expressive art is a story of some type, and the arts seem to function as a catalyst to embolden us to tell our story and want to listen to the story of others. And then as we listen to the stories, and I think this is the real solution for loneliness type 3, existential, spiritual loneliness, we then feel we're part of a bigger story. And this correlates with other brain functions of awe and wonder, where we know people relax and they become less afraid of connecting with other people, less ego-driven, kinder, and so on. So that's all going on. It's like if this were a pharmaceutical, it would be a multi-billion-dollar blockbuster. So highly personalized, and it's fun and non-threatening, and can engage people of all ages. It gives people a chance to express who they are. It activates them, as I said, cognitively, how they think, emotionally, how they feel, and behaviorally, how they connect. And, and ultimately it connects people to themselves and others. So I thought, okay, well, that sounds good, but how do we really tell this story? So we spent about 9 months building a short animated video I'm about to share that'll show the lonely brain, and then it'll show how the arts can actually repair some of the things going on in the brain and what the consequences are. So enjoy the video.
Loneliness can kill you, but it doesn't have to. Here's why. Loneliness may be the most human of feelings. Occasional pangs of loneliness are helpful signals from your brain saying you need to be with others, just as feelings of thirst mean you need water. However, if left unchecked, loneliness can fundamentally rewire your brain in harmful ways. Chronic loneliness increases inflammation, raises blood pressure, and impairs the immune system, making you more likely to get sick. More insidiously, the lonely brain begins to see even routine social interactions as risky, which drives lonely habits, like viewing the world as threatening, not thinking clearly, and acting impulsively. These habits make it harder to connect with people and create a spiraling cycle that stops you from seeking the exact thing that could help reduce loneliness: meaningful engagement with others. But here's the exciting news. Scientists have found that the arts also rewire your brain, and in a positive way. When you're making or enjoying art, levels of the fight or flight hormone go down, and levels of feel-good hormones go up. And recent brain imaging research shows that the parts of your brain involved in forming social connections, the ones affected by loneliness, also light up when you engage in creative experiences. This research suggests that the arts can increase feelings of trust, empathy, and compassion. By being imaginative and creative, you can start a positive cycle that fights against loneliness. Creative engagement can reduce stress, lighten your mood, connect you with your inner self, and strengthen your brain's social superhighways, sparking brain activities that make it easier to connect with others. The simple and joyful act of creative exploration can take many forms. When you pursue one that moves you, your perception of the world changes. Compassion can replace conflict. You'll see opportunities where you once saw threats. Welcome this signal. Use the arts to navigate loneliness in a deeply human, health-enhancing, and lifelong way.
Okay, that's our public service announcement for our Arts and Connection. Okay, I'll let you go back. All right, so now we could just say, oh, that's great. Now let's look at the data and so on. But we're going to go in a different direction. We're going to do something interactive, where you're each going to have a chance to do something creative. So we're going to pass around 3x5 inch note cards, and these short stubby pencils that you use for golf course scores. And we're going to make some art together. I promise it won't hurt. Can I see the hands of people who are nervous about making art? Oh, great, you're going to have a great time. Because we're going to walk you through it, every step, every step. That's okay. Nerves, that's just your brain's way of telling you you're doing something that matters. Yeah. Okay, who still needs, everybody have their 3x5 note card and some way of making words happen on it? Anyone still need a note card? We're good? Pencil? Pen? Everyone set? Okay. So we're gonna write a haiku together. Actually, each of you is gonna write a haiku. It won't be a collaborative effort. But first, some of you may not know what a haiku is, so I thought I'd give you a brief primer. The name of the hottest Asian fusion restaurant in Boston, since this is a higher ed place. This is a quiz. What is a haiku? So, name of the hottest Asian fusion restaurant in Boston. A short poetic form developed by the Japanese with 3 lines, the first having 5 syllables, the second 7 syllables, and the last 5 syllables. A really great way to impress your friends and appear cultured and sophisticated without having to do too much work. This may come in handy. The way we are going to include you in this talk, and then E, all of the above except for A. Hands for A? No. It's E. Okay, we'll just move right along here. Quick, how many of you have written a haiku? Okay, good. All right. So I thought I'd share, just to get the ball rolling, I would share my pandemic haiku from October 2020. I will. I should, huh? The world is a mess. Notice 5 syllables. No one knows what happens next. I need a haircut. Remember those days? I really needed a haircut. Okay, so now you're going to write an unlonely haiku. So I'll keep this reminder, of the first line 5 syllables, second 7, last line 5, right? And you can count on your fingers. But you have to write it in response to this prompt. So recall a moment in your life when making or experiencing something artistically creative, a song, a poem, a photo, maybe even something you saw this evening, right? When you looked at the artwork, or even homemade cookies, gave you inspiring positive feelings like joy, excitement, wonder, or hope. In your haiku, try to capture that moment and how it felt. So don't just describe the moment, but how it felt. And you can count on your fingers. Matt, see, showed the rest of us how to do that. That's excellent. And we're going to give you, and it's a fast exercise. So we're just going to give you 3 minutes. So get going. 3 lines. 5 syllables in the first, 7, 5. Some piece of creative expression that really moved you. And capture the moment and how it felt. And it could be it doesn't have to be classic art. It could be a moment in nature too, because Picasso called nature God's canvas. Okay, we're going to kind of wrap it up. You can keep, kind of adjusting it. But, okay, so now's the moment of possible bravery. If I would anyone like to read their haiku out loud? Yes, please. Back row first. Oh, could you just stand up and because that way it's easier to hear you. And start with your name.
Oh, my name's Erin.
Hi, Erin.
Kneading lucky dough, apples cheddar added in, autumn warms my heart.
Wow, okay, and a round of applause for everyone brave enough to read their haiku.
Sure. Kristen. Running through the trails, tiny kitten, Jose James, giant redwood trees.
Beautiful. Okay. That's a transformative moment. Nicely done. Who else? Michael.
Someone from the front row. So he said my name, Michael. Expressing the grief of the death of Pentheus rolled through the hushed crowd.
Wow, okay. Classic. Man with the classics. Okay. Come on, a few more. These are fun. Oh, there you go.
Laura, magical senses, beds of leaves surrounding me, Maine, my heart thinks you.
Yes, okay. Back to nature and leaves. Mary, what do you think?
Just prove that I am not creative and using my best pen, drawing myself on a bike, achieved perspective.
Beautiful. Yeah. Okay, we have time for two more. Brave souls, yes.
It's about the time that I saw the Northern Lights. The sky shimmering green as far as I can see. It is wondrous.
Wow, terrific. Thank you. One last one. Yes.
Mine comes from one of the artworks that was up on our slides, and it caught me. So, caught by the wheelchair, red, blue, purple opening. I am not alone.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you. Couldn't end on a better one. An I am not alone haiku. I love that. Okay, so now, how was that? Did you enjoy it, or did you hate it, or what was interesting? Just some comments. The man nodding in the back row. How was that for you?
It was good.
Yeah, in what way?
I don't know. I think people were being, kind of vulnerable in a light way, and it
Yeah.
does create a feeling of connection.
Yeah. And that's a big thing in our, so we run programs and workshops, and people think, okay, to be creative, huge degrees of vulnerability, and it can be that, but it can also be light. And in doing the light stuff, it's just like, it's like an invitation to connect with other people, like low risk art. It's really important. Other people, how was it? Particularly people who didn't necessarily feel comfortable being creative. Oh, I think you had your hand up, Michael, about that. So how was it?
I wrote a haiku about that. Poems never work the way I imagine they will when I think them.
Oh my God, a second haiku. Well, that's true about art, because art doesn't live in the cognitive. So when we think, okay, am I going to be able to make good art? Then that's when you get into self-judgment and, writer's block, painter's block, all that stuff. Yeah, but if you just do it, sometimes you can navigate around it.
That's true.
It also brings you right in the present. I mean, it brings you into the present
Yes.
with a certain degree of mindfulness.
Yeah.
And you can't be in the present and the future and the past at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the beautiful things about creative making is it puts you in the moment. Another thing which I put, it does tend to put you, it reminds you that you get to make choices, right? Because you had that experience, right? This word, that word, line break, in painting, what color, what brush stroke, and somehow it's useful to be reminded we get to make choices when we live in a world where we often feel we have less and less autonomy and flexibility to make choices. But it also puts you in touch with the bigger story. For instance, the Northern Light, haiku. It's so beautiful, right? Everyone, millions of people get to have that same experience. So you have the personal experience, and you know that other people are having it too. And I think the arts often bring us to the collective that way. Any other thoughts on the experience?
I love counting the numbers.
Yeah, the syllables you mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like somehow there's just this playfulness of like
Yeah.
finding the words that
Yeah.
will match the numbers, and I felt very, I don't know, like literary professor in me turned off, and I was just messing around.
Wonderful. Yeah, the other thing that I like about this form, and there are other creative forms to do it, is actually having to navigate constraints.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Because this is the human experience, is navigating constraints. As anyone who's been in any kind of relationship knows, or workplace knows, it's constraints. But it's so concrete and tangible here. How many syllables, constraints, got to change the word. Yeah. And then I think you had a thought?
I was just going to compliment the prompt. I teach writing, and it's hard to come up with something good to have people do that feels meaningful in 3 minutes, but a different prompt could have had completely different results. Right?
Yeah.
By the time you felt lonely.
Yeah.
Write a haiku about when you felt lonely would have been disastrous, right?
Yeah, there's certain things, that you want to get up to. Like one of my favorite prompts that I will never use, which is write a haiku about something you want to be forgiven for.
Ooh.
Right? Because almost everyone, is actually pretty reachable with that, but you don't necessarily want to make it in a social. But it's a great point. You don't have to go to that. You could do, kind of what delights you. So about joy. Okay. So I'm going to wrap up here. I love this quote by Nietzsche, because I've noted since college, we have art so that we may not die of reality. I actually, when I first read, I thought, oh, he's making a joke. He's being ironic. But actually, he's just telling it the way he thought it, which is our brains and the art making generate reality. It's not out there. It's how we interpret, how we make sense of it. So I think he was onto something important. Just real quick, so Project Unlonely, I just want to tell people about it because part of what we're trying to do is get the word out about what we're up to with it. So it's got 3 goals. One is to increase awareness about loneliness and its toxicity. The second is to reduce the stigma around it. And the third is to make creative-based activations available at the community level, and we package those workshops and we make them available to community-based organizations. At the heart of every workshop is the 3 things we all did tonight: to be curious, respond to the prompt, to make something, you made haikus, and to have conversations. So that's at the core of all we do. We use a lot of mindfulness too. So we're expanding beyond basic loneliness. Long COVID is big on our list for a variety of reasons. 17 million people have long COVID, but it's also part of a category of diseases that I'm starting to call edge of medicine diseases, where you just don't have a good answer for it. And the others that are very similar to this are chronic fatigue syndrome, chronic Lyme, just multiple organ involvement, a lot of inflammation. And then people aren't talking about the fact that loneliness, which is common to all those conditions, actually is pro-inflammatory and immune suppressive. So people aren't looking at the fact that what they thought is almost like a social condition is actually probably fundamental to the biology of the disease. But it hasn't been included in the research. So we're trying to figure out if we can create more visibility on that. The second thing we're really kind of interested in, I know this sounds grim, but it's dying unlonely, right? It's very stigmatized in this culture. It's best characterized by a Woody Allen quote, which is, "I'm not afraid of dying, I just don't want to be there when it happens." But that's how we feel. But other cultures understand, particularly the Eastern cultures. You're born, you thrive, you dwindle, you die. And then in some of those cultures, it just starts over again. But every stage is as important. And particularly when you get to memorialization, which is one of the themes for tonight, you begin to see how you can cherish every one of those steps. And if you do, then maybe death will be less terrifying for people. I think there's a lot of suffering in this cult. I know there is because as an internal medicine physician, you see, you're honored to be at the end of life for many people. And then the last thing is to actually look at stigma as a kind of a through line. In a way, it generates loneliness, type 2, systematic exclusion. But it's also more than, it erodes people's self-confidence. They think, oh my God, I did something wrong. That's why I'm this way. That's why people are stigmatizing my situation. So we think there are things we can do about it. While the modern world and emerging technologies can isolate us, we think they can also connect us. We're doing some work with some AI-generated creative expression materials, working with Mass General Brigham, with caregivers for dementia. And there's some pretty interesting things there. And I'll just leave you with this thought that's in the book. Your habits of personal creative expression are just as important to your health and well-being as your diet, exercise, and sleep. Art is a medicine that requires no prescription and no copay. And I'll close with this Picasso quote: "Anything you can imagine is real." So he must have been reading Nietzsche when he said this. An honor to be with you all tonight and to be part of this evening. Thank you so much.